So Astyartha is an undergraduate student at the Department of English, Szirák University. Her areas of interest include South Asian and post-colonial literature, queer studies, film studies, women's studies, Dalit studies, and modernism. She's presented papers about the above-mentioned areas in several conferences, and for 3 consecutive years, she was the winner of the MP Birla Foundation's essay writing competition per septum. So over to you, Astyartha, on your paper and on Richmal Crompton and Just William.
Thank you so much. And yeah, good afternoon from here. Good morning to you all in other parts of the world. Okay, so I'll basically speak about Richmal Crompton and her William stories, not in any order. And I'll just focus on the only novel of the series, which is Just William's Luck. So yeah, so time can devour everything except William. So we see here a graphic from a story of William, where he's confident enough to lecture people about winning the war. So we get the gist of who he is. And yeah, so from time immemorial, poets and philosophers have whined about the mortal inability to fathom the illusion of time. All existential lustre comes to a standstill as the metaphorical sand of time keeps slipping through the hourglass and ringing bells of oblivion. Kurt Vonnegut writes, "Here we are, trapped in the amber of the moment. There is no why." Richmal Crompton's quintessentially notorious, vehemently anti-establishment prepubescent protagonist William Brown seems to be trapped in the amber of the moment too. The moment being the age of 11. Richmal Crompton started writing stories for the Just William series in 1922, and for the past 100 years, William has stuck to his evergreen 11. It is important to point out that William's age has stood at a standstill, not just because of the author giving life to his 11th year through the engraving of the written word, not just because Crompton wanted to follow Shakespeare's ideal of so long as men can breathe and eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee, while constructing the character of William, but rather, time moves at its own pace in William's world, and yet William's age remains unaffected by time. Firmly holding on to his 11th year, the world of William is affected by several social and political ruptures that are indicative of different time periods. For example, William the Conqueror, the time alludes to the 11th century English monarch of the same name, contains background details about pre-World War I imperialism. William the Dictator alludes to the immediate phenomena of the occurrence of fascism just a year before the beginning of World War II, and William and the Moon Rocket and William and the Space Animal capture the contemporary thrill of venturing into space. Therefore, William's tryst with time is quite mind-boggling because unlike legendary Indian director Satyajit Ray's phenomenon singers Gopi and Bagha, William does not need to put a spell on everyone to make time stand still. Time is a spinning wheel in the hands of William, who spares time from being a captive under him and instead simply chooses to make himself stand fixed to his age while time runs amok. Possessing the ability to voluntarily take a stance against the inevitable changeability of time, William is no less than a superhero. Albeit, a superhero whose intentions are never understood and whose actions are never received with positive fervor. Nonetheless, that did not deter the determined superhero in William the Superman to chart out a plan to break free from the shackles of the rotten adult world by inaugurating a new civilization. It is only fitting to conclude the discussion about William and time by underlining the reason why this discussion is of importance in the first place. This is because even after 100 years, the primary appeal of the William stories is their timelessness. In the foreword to Mary Cadogan's biography of Crompton, titled Richmal Crompton, the Woman Behind Just William, Martin Jarvis writes about the William's timelessness and places it in a broader literary context. So we can read it here. It seems from letters and reactions I received from listeners of all ages who hear my performances of William stories on BBC radio or audio that it's their timelessness that appeals so much. Overall, this presides the remarkable character of Master William Brown, whose motives are always of the best and the highest. His genius as a free spirit, lateral thinker, and all-round good egg is, I feel certain, a true reflection of the imaginative genius of his creator. So we move on to the life and times of Richmal Crompton. Richmal Crompton Lambourne has often been assumed to be a man, the reason for which is perhaps her unusual Christian name, according to Mary Cadogan. Richmal Crompton Lambourne was born in Bury, Lancashire on 15 November 1890. She taught classics for 5 years at Bromley High School, a girls' public day school trust establishment which at that time was located in Enfield Road of Bromley High School. Her teaching career was cut short at the end of 1923 after she contracted poliomyelitis, now simply known as polio, but at that time generally called infantile paralysis, which caused her to lose the use of her right leg. She tried to carry on teaching, but was advised to give up by her doctor. She was already writing short stories while teaching under the name Richmal Crompton. Initially published in Happy Mag, a number of short stories were published in a book called Just William, which was published in 1922. After giving up her teaching career, she concentrated on writing. In addition to her William books, she published 4 other children's books and 50 novels or collections of short stories intended for adults, though none of these had the success of her William books. While living in Bromley, her fame as a writer enabled her to travel widely. Despite her disability, but she maintained an interest in local matters and joined the Auxiliary Fire Service during World War II. And therein emerges the post-war humor in the William stories, where this 11-year-old savior is eager to teach the world about how to win the war. In the story William and ARP, William lectures a group of boys about the strategy to be followed in order to win the war. However, he's cut short by uproar from the boys about his statement that bombs smell of pear drops. Trivial issues are bloated up and Richmal's humor borders on parody more often than not. Mary Cadogan writes, frequently one feels that she is parodying herself as readily and as incisively as other people and using William as a comic but nevertheless potent devil's advocate. In the context of her disability, it is important to note that Richmal Crompton did not let her disability push her down even when the society around her was ready to marginalize her. Instead, she accepted her disability in her stride and did not stop working. While starting off with the William stories, Crompton's intention was to write serious potboiler novels meant for an adult audience. But once she started writing about William, things seemed to spin out of control as William started being well received by youngsters. Though 11 in age, William Brown had enough confidence to be a change maker and also had enough power over everything around him, including his creator. In fact, Lambourne frequently referred to her literary brainchild as a Frankenstein monster. I sometimes say that I must have got rid of all my criminal tendencies in William, and if I hadn't written the William stories, I might have ended in jail. But he just sort of kept me to the grindstone. She said shortly before her death. He takes possession of every story I try to write, even though they are not about William. Crompton was an active advocate for the women's suffrage movement. By the time her novels began to be published, middle-class and war-weary women had already wrested the vote from male politicians. The male politicians could no longer insist on women's total passivity and domestic orientation, since the women had an impressive contribution in the war front. Had William come upon the literary scene a few years earlier, Richmal would surely have sent up the more extreme activities of the militant suffragettes by letting her anarchic anti-hero loose on them. Denied such opportunities by the time scale of the women's suffrage campaign, she contented herself with an occasional swipe at female chauvinists. In William the Good, the ladies of a literary society that has sprung up in a village are determined to keep their membership secret and to confine entry to their own sex only. Their view is, as soon as you begin to have men in a thing, it complicates it at once. There's something restless about men, and they aren't literary. It's no good pretending they are. The character of William, described by Mary Cadogan as anarchic, disheveled, obstructionist, opinionated, and unbookish to the point of Philistinism, was the direct opposite of his creator, who was a staunch conservative and a member of the Church of England. Even when the William stories started being well received by children and teenagers, Richmal Crompton maintained the writing style and thematic framework that was initially formulated to cater to adults. This could probably be a reason behind the consciously political underpinnings in William's world. It is almost as if William is a child while harboring a childish temperament, along with a complete awareness of the vices and virtues of the adult world. The first story was published in 1922 when Richmal Crompton was 31 years old. The last of the 38 William books was published in 1972, the year after her death in 1969. The stories were collected in book form and released beginning in 1922 with the book Just William in cheap editions packaged to appeal to the youth market. In William Forever, Richmal Crompton's unusual achievement, Betty Greenway, highlights the trajectory of the publication and reception history of the Williams stories. She writes, the stories continued to appear in magazines before being collected in books until wartime paper shortages ended many weeklies and monthlies in 1940. After that, they were released directly in book form. The 38 William book appearing posthumously in 1970, a year after Crompton's death at age 78. How enormously popular have these books been and indeed continue to be. They have sold over 12 million copies and are all still in print even after almost 80 years. After Crompton's death, many thought the books would be too old-fashioned for the swinging 60s in Britain, but Macmillan began publishing paperback facsimiles of the original edition, which continue to be on the bookshelves of High Street, W.H. Smith and Waterstone stores. Recently, Macmillan also released a new series for younger readers, aged about 6 to 8, called Meet Just William, himself a William fan and reader of the stories on radio and very popular series of audio cassettes. Actor Martin Jarvis played the role of William in the series. There have been several dramatizations over the years in a feature film in 1939 and television series in 1962, 77, and most recently 1994. As librarians in Britain will attest, the books are always checked out, and I discovered when I tried to borrow them, many young readers have become members of William's Outlaws Club, an organization still sponsored by the publishers. Even though a changemaker William did not know the proper spelling of statue, he had the confidence that one day he would achieve enough fame to have statues, which he spells as Stachos, erected in his name. And that happens to be true because William Brown's wax statue stands in the Madame Tussaud Museum and also at the World of William exhibition at the Bethnal Green Museum of Childhood, according to Cardovan. So now we're going to talk about Just William's Luck, the novel which I'll focus on. So this is the only novel of the entire legacy of William. It is unique because it is extremely nuanced in the usage of humor to depict the adult world. Richmal Crompton uses light-hearted satire and irony to depict the glaring realities of the adult world as seen by truant children like William and his gang called outlaws. Unlike Indian novelist Narayan Gangopadhyay's Tenida, William is not just a gang leader who lives in a world of self-sustained fantasy, but also someone who is often roasted by his other gang members for being insensible and irrational. As much as the general concept of hierarchy is questioned, Richmal Crompton exercises her feminist agency to pinpoint the existence of gender hierarchy and misogyny even in the world of children. At the beginning of the novel, Crompton describes a very seemingly regular household situation at the Brown family and uses her signature style of light-hearted comedy to depict the troubles of Emily, the household help, weighed down by responsibilities of being the caretaker of the house and the Brown family members. By virtue of serving the family for quite a long time, Emily had become initiated into the personal space of the family, and thus her frustration was also very familiar to what might be called the frustration of other female family members too. Crompton describes the suffering as patient suffering. So there's this paragraph where Crompton writes about how Emily feels. And quite suddenly, the Browns become too much for Emily. This happened on an average once every 3 months. She would endure them and in her heart of hearts adored them for weeks on end, and then quite suddenly they would become too much for her. Her face worked in an alarming fashion, like something set in motion by a complicated piece of clockwork, and a sound issued like the whirling of rusty wheels. Emily is someone who is skeptical of each and every step of William and would be more than happy to blame him for everything that goes wrong in the house. On the other hand, William's mother, Mrs. Brown, has her protest ready every time she reverts back at Emily, saying, "I think that's very unfair, Emily. William isn't responsible for everything that goes wrong in this house." The outlaws are stereotypical, notorious teenagers because the only way to restore amity for them is to have an exhilarating scuffle and to roll about on the floor and sit on each other, scramble to their feet while panting and being disheveled. The leader of the outlaws is portrayed as a misfit in the mannerly world, fitting well to the title of belonging to a gang of guys who take pride in defying the law and everything that is institutional. Like a condemned man to the scaffold, he accompanied Robert across the field, back to the soap and brush, the table napkin and table manners of a despised civilization. So when he's not with his group of outlaws, William just feels that he's trapped in a very despised civilization. So that is very interesting. Soon enough, it becomes clear that Mr. Brown's obsession with manners is one of the primary reasons behind William's urge to break rules. The irony of the adult world's reality comes to the fore when William's logic is suppressed by his parents in an irrational way. A typical dining table conversation is described in a very humorous way by Crompton. And don't talk with your mouth full. No, father, said William, but it's jolly difficult to know what to do. People say answer when you're spoken to, and don't talk with your mouth full. So if you just got your mouth full when someone asks you something, you've better got to do something wrong. If you wait till you've chewed it up and swallowed it before you answer, then you're not answering when you're spoken to. And if so yeah, this is just a household battle that goes on, and William tries to use his logic, but his logic is unfortunately not workable in the adult world. And now the character of Violet Elizabeth is perhaps the most important of all the characters, all the other children with whom William engages with. And the introduction of Violet Elizabeth is a very significant moment in the novel. And the words that Crompton uses to describe Violet is indicative of the gender politics that she wants to highlight. Crompton writes, Violet Elizabeth was a child of 6. And here we should remember that all the other boys, including William, were like 10 or 11. So she was considerably younger. With a dominating personality, a ruthless will, and a misleadingly winsome expression. She also had a list that some people, though not the outlaws, found engaging. Her chief aim in life was to attach herself to the outlaws in general, and William in particular, and some uncanny instincts seemed to lead her unerringly to any place where they were. So being a disabled woman herself, I think somehow Crompton tried to reflect in the character of Violet Elizabeth the resilience that can exist despite disability, even when you are being discriminated because of your disability. So this girl is considerably younger, as I already said, and the following conversation between Violet and the outlaws highlights how the construct of gender and gender binaries percolate within the apparently uncomplicated spaces of children as well. So they talk about being knights, and I'm going to show a video at the end of my presentation about this taking oath as knights thing. So that's the context, and Violet wants to be a knight too, but she's told that she cannot be a knight because knights are men, William says. And then Violet is very confident about the fact that there would be a woman knight if she was one. And then they say that okay, to be a knight, someone has to rescue a damsel in distress. So Violet is hellbent that okay, I will have a role to play, I will be the damsel in distress then. So yeah, she says, I'll be the damsel in distress, shall I? Then you can rescue me, then you can rescue me so that they can rescue her. So she just wants to be included, and she will be included no matter how much the others want to exclude her. Later, Violet stands up for herself, speaking against the ill treatment she faces at the hands of the outlaws. For a 6-year-old among a gang of 11-year-old boys, Violet's strength of character is remarkably inspiring, and she is indeed a woman written by a woman. Violet tells the boys, you all have been very nasty to me. I wouldn't be queen if you asked me to, and I don't want any nasty bread knife, and I didn't pull it out of the solid rock, because I've seen it at your mouth, and I've been to a tea, and all I've seen you pull it off solid bread. I'm going home now, and I'm not going to say goodbye to you, though there. As mentioned earlier, William's world is quite politically aware, and a striking example of that is when their rival Hubert Lane is captured and they threaten to do with him what is done to spies. The fact that spies were executed in the adult world, and especially in a post-World War scenario, was an information with which the outlaws were quite familiar, and hence William's faith in himself to deliver better speeches than the Prime Minister leads him to pursue a mission to right the wrongs of the world, a mission that is motivated by the desire to change the existing state of affairs in the world. William's capitalistic acumen comes to the fore when he defends the commercial viability of his scheme as a response to Douglas's doubts. Douglas is doubtful whether this idea of righting wrongs and getting people to pay them for that, or getting people to pay them in by means for that, not by money probably, that would work, because Douglas thinks that no, people would not be so interested in righting wrongs. But William has his defense ready, that people in history paid pounds to get wrongs righted. Apparently a statement which is very casual, but it does carry pounds of weight, I think. So the primary mission, however, is to right the wrong of his elder brother Robert not being 21 and still not married. William builds up a world in his own mind and chooses a bride for Robert and creates situations of utter confusion and embarrassment for Robert. William seems to be role-playing as the guardian of his elder brother as he thinks about his plan. He had, he hoped, planted a seed in Robert's mind that would eventually flower and bear fruit. After their long and confidential conversation, Robert's thoughts must surely be turning to marriage, and Gloria Gay was the obvious goal to which those thoughts must tend. But Gloria Gay herself must be prepared. Robert must be firmly established in Gloria's eyes as her suitor, so that before they met, the foundations of the whole affair should be well and truly laid. The idea of getting Robert married was taking firm hold of William's mind. Not only would it assure him a bicycle, but the thought of a Robertless home was, on the whole, a pleasant one. So William was a quintessential 11-year-old whose main motive in life was, if you don't have a problem, if there's not a problem in the world around you, just create a problem. A series of comical events follow as William tries to set up the marriage of his brother without being slightly aware of the fact that Robert already had a girlfriend. What follows is almost like a ballroom drama of suitors fighting with each other and misunderstanding each other. A similar kind of conundrum ensues in William's sister Ethel's life too, as she is pursued by too many suitors, but is too preoccupied with her knitting to pay proper attention to any. Now, Crompton's comical approach to this idea of marriage or suitors pursuing each other is probably also motivated by the fact that she was someone who was very averse to marriage as an institution. She never got married herself, and so in the William stories, from the vantage point of a 11-year-old, she is viewing marriage as something really important, something really something that makes a person whole, and trying to bring out the comedy of the entire situation, the comedy of the socialization that makes people obligated to indulge in marriage. Through William suitors, and we can see these two sketches, about William telling his brother to get married, and then he goes to this woman that William has chosen, Gloria Gay, so that she agrees to marry Robert. And though William's notoriety, Crompton attempts to bring out the laughability and instability in the apparently serious, stable lives of adults. William's intervention into the adult world strips it of its pretend and remains thereof, is William's timeless realization that grown-ups get sort of tired just being with grown-up. I've often noticed it. This novel mainly focuses on and the comedy in this novel mainly arises out of these situations that arise in the family and in the conversations between the outlaws and when Violet comes in, and eventually the gang goes on to catch a group of coat smugglers, and a police officer who actually rescues them after all the scuffle asks them if he will drop them grandly in a police car to their homes, and then they reject the offer. So then the police officer salutes the knights of the square table, because there are 4 members in the outlaws, so it's not the round table, it's square table. And that is how the novel ends. But that is not exactly too much that does not really have too much of comedy in it. That is more of an adventure story of a teenage adventure story. But I think the video that I'm going to show is about William and his outlaws, their meeting spot, which is very restricted. No one is allowed to enter, and his older brother comes searching for him. So I'm just playing the video. Okay. So
now, what possibly could William have for a red knife? Grasping the sword Excalibur by the hilt, King Arthur slowly drew it out of the solid rock. Well, what happened then? I'm just telling you. Well, go on then, hurry up. As he was the only one who could pull Excalibur out of the rock, they knew he was meant to be king. Then he started the Knights of the Round Table. All right. I know. What book is it? Everyone knows about the Knights of the Round Table. They went around righting wrongs and rescuing girls. They brought succor to damsels in distress. Well, they did that too. It's the alarm. I think they just been an enemy approaching.
Yeah, so I would just want to end the presentation with the note that throughout the William series, what Crompton tries to convey is that the adults do not really understand William, and yet William is this quintessential savior, this person who is totally confident about winning the war, more than the political leaders were probably at that time. So they could have sought William's counsel or something like that. But yeah, and William has many interesting ways uh, to look at the adult world, from which the comedy of Richmal Crompton emerges. I think it is a very natural style. Like, the comedy is not imposed in any way. Richmal Crompton is not like you have to laugh. Okay, I'm holding you to the news. You have to laugh because this is a funny story about an 11-year-old who wants to save the world. It's not like that. It emerges out of very valid questions that William asks, which seem funny to us as adults, but which are valid questions if we look back to when we were 11 and when we had those questions in our minds. So yes, thank you. And
Thank you very, very much, Astyartha. That's terrific. Well done. Personally, I'm ashamed. I don't actually know very much about Just William books. Some really interesting things. I've got a copy upstairs, which I need to go and read immediately. Well, not absolutely immediately, because we've got some panels to go first. But thank you so, so much for that. Our next panelist, I'm just adjusting the screen so I can see my notes, is Anna Szirák, who's a PhD student of English Language and Literature at the Doctoral School of Literary and Cultural Studies at the University of Debrecen in Hungary. And she researches girlhood studies in the realms of gender and cultural studies, with a dissertation on girlhood in literature and film, with the understanding that girlhood is a productive motif that enriches texts and literary analysis, despite having largely been ignored. Over to you and welcome, Anna.
Thank you so much for your introduction. Let me just again try to share my screen here. Thank you again. And of course, hello to everyone in the panel and in the conference. I am, first of all, very grateful for the opportunity to be able to present here as a PhD student. And I will, venture to investigate the slightly rhetorical question of, are women funny? And in this presentation today, I will be talking about the comic modes of girlhood in Dodie Smith's novel, I Captured a Castle, and the attempt to give an answer to the questions, are girls funny? And also the second, why and how are girls funny? Again, first, just a very brief outline for my presentation today. I will give you a short introduction to the author, Dodie Smith, and her novel, I Captured a Castle. And from then, I will go on to discuss how the themes of girlhood encounter with humor and the comic in the novel, by giving a close reading of 2 specific episodes in the novel, which I call the bath and the bear episodes, respectively. And again, finally, as a conclusion, a tentative conclusion, I will venture to talk about how the comic functions in the novel by providing a magnifying glass to the voice of girlhood. Again, on my 3rd slide now. So just as an introduction to our author here, what we have to know about Dodie Smith is that she was born in 1896 and passed away in 1990. Her most well-known novel is probably 101 Dalmatians, but I Captured a Castle, published in 1948, is a close second. I Captured a Castle tells the story of adolescent Cassandra Mortmain, a teen girl heroine who, as she herself admits, looks young and feels old, as she narrates the life of her family in a decaying castle and in the form of a diary. And when it comes to this novel, in my talk today, I basically argue that comedy functions as a magnifying glass for the anxieties of girlhood that Cassandra and her sister Rose face in the narrative, and that Cassandra's both understated and exaggerated narration and narrational style provides relief and a coping mechanism in the teenage girl's identity formation and path towards adulthood. But first, of course, when it comes to the role of comedy in girlhood, we have to reckon with the obvious fact that comedy is and has been decidedly a gendered theme or topic. Yet, of course, we also know that comedy as a genre has been considered to be better suited for females than the so-called loftier tragedy. One only has to think of Jane Austen, the master of irony. And I mention Austen specifically because of Northanger Abbey, whose heroine Catherine Morland's fantastical imaginings actually connect this Austenian style to Dodie Smith, as Cassandra herself in I Captured the Castle encounters or experiences exaggerated imaginings and imagings herself, as we will see. Venturing into comedy, the real question is not whether women were permitted to be comic, but whether they were expected to conform to certain kinds of comedy consonant with female propriety and chastity, as Annette Wheeler Caffarelli writes. If so, then female comedy, then if so, then it is true that while female comedy has been around, it is still true that the comic woman can be seen as suspect, and that wit in women in general has been traditionally considered to be somewhat a dangerous quality. And now, when it comes to the dangers of wit, certainly we can start talking about the current as well as traditional understanding of girlhood as menace or danger itself. Among others, Paul Amarantz Cohen talks about the destabilizing role of the daughter within the family unit, while Mary Pfeiffer highlights adolescent girlhood as a time of crisis. And Carol Diehouse also goes as far to talk about girlhood as a dangerous phase. And in my opinion, even more notably, Beth Rogers discusses the borderlands and thresholds of girlhood, creating a sense of a spatial and a no man's land-like conception of being a girl and experiencing girlhood. In literature, the anxieties of being a girl have been conceptualized, for instance, as modes of horror, famously in Le Fanu's 19th century novella Carmilla, a vampire story, or in the fairly recent teenage horror flick Jennifer's Body from 2009. Yet I Captured the Castle, the novel, decidedly turns towards modes of the comic and to humor to map out the no man's land of girlhood. This time of constant change is made funny and even at times outlandish in order to affect the reader. Then if women as such have to struggle with crossing boundaries of chastity and propriety, the question arises of what boundaries and thresholds girls have to cross, and have to be crossed in girlish comedy. And of course, the question of are girls even funny may come to mind. When it comes to I Captured the Castle, playwright Drumlin Druten found the novel so trivial. He was often touched, always eager to go on reading, but he resented this, felt it was like eating a box of chocolates without stopping, as Dodie Smith herself writes. Well, the notion of I Captured the Castle presenting as trivial brings up first the issue of the Bergsonian comic, of course, meaning that laughter requires an indifference, a detachment from sensibility and emotion. And this aspect is certainly helped by Smith's use of mixing girlish exaggeration with the very British notion of understatement, such as Cassandra, again, declaring to the world, "I would rather die than marry either of those quite nice men." And yet, what makes for the quality of the comic for the novel is, I believe, the stark realities behind these exaggerated statements. We as readers laugh at Cassandra because we feel for her. And so our laughter works as a mode of compassion. For as I have already marked, Cassandra's narration images and maps girlhood apprehensions, despite being lightheartedly put. There is indeed a discrepancy throughout the novel between Cassandra's language use and the realities of the story, marking humor as a form of relief in the book. For instance, Cassandra makes light of the deep, concerning poverty of the Mortmain family and creates a tableau of the 1930s as an end of an era before the war and as a time of recession and again constant change. Indeed, as she discusses their concerning diet and lack of food, she says cheerfully, "I thank heaven there is no cheaper form of bread than bread." Certainly, humor as relief not only downplays, it actually also magnifies in the novel. As girlhood is a time of, again, constant change and moving, this aspect is literalized in the novel. Cassandra's body throughout is moving through the spaces of the castle. She starts off in an odd space in the kitchen sink, as she writes in very famously, the first sentence of the novel is, "I write this sitting in the kitchen sink." She continues moving on all the way to her father's study, to his desk, and to other odd spaces throughout as the story goes on. Of course, marking and calling attention to teenage Cassandra's oddity, her misfitness, and even the displacement of girlhood as she experiences it. And I believe that this same oddity and heightened nature are at work in the two comic episodes, which I focus on in my reading of the novel. Again, the bath and the bear episodes. Here you may see a quote, a longer quote I have highlighted from the from the bath episode. Again, let me read it out. Someone came into the kitchen. I could feel someone just standing and staring. "Whoever you are, I warn you, I'm in the bath here." "Good heavens, I do beg your pardon," said the man with the quiet voice. I had mopped my face and neck on the drying sheets and still hadn't taken the cold walk to find a towel. I asked him if he could see it anywhere, but he didn't seem able to. So I knelt in the bath, parted the green sheets, and put my head through. He turned towards me. Seldom have I felt more astonished. He had a black beard. I have never known anyone with a beard, except an old man in the Scotney almshouses who looks like Santa Claus. This beard wasn't like that. It was trim and pointed, rather Elizabethan. But it was very surprising because his voice had sounded quite young. "How do you do?" he asked, smiling, and I could tell by his tone that he had taken me for a child. "There's no need to look so scared. I'll put the towel down where you can reach it and go right back to the yard." "I'm not scared," I said, "but you don't look the way you sound." Now, in this scene, already the oddity and again misfitness are brought to the surface as the reader is presented with a girl in the bathtub and the tub is situated in the places of the kitchen. Again, a space that can be and is walked in on by any person, in this case, a strange young man, Simon Cotton. This scene and the whole encounter between the two starts up with a quite Dantean warning. Of course, as Cassandra says, "Whoever you are, I warn you, I'm in the bath here." And this warning applies to both Cassandra and to Simon. Well, first, they are now in a social situation with no immediate ready-made rules. And also the warning is important because of what it establishes between the two of them. This fateful acquaintance between Cassandra and Simon Cotton, who is to be her eventual love interest. Certainly, oddity and split can be used to describe both parties in the scene. As Cassandra says to Simon, you don't look the way you sound. And again, this is true both ways, as Cassandra is mistaken for a young old child when she kneels in the bath. If you recall, she comes off much shorter, almost as a midget of some kind, while Simon is a source of astonishment. Oh, I'm so sorry. Is a source of astonishment for Cassandra because he has a young man's voice and intonation, but he has something that alienates and even terrifies Cassandra for about 200 pages of the novel, and that is a black beard. Now, while this whole bath sequence places Cassandra's naked body at the center and to a place where it can be walked in on by young men, Simon's beard also acts as a signifier. It is a point of not just contention, but of fear, disgust for both Cassandra and her sister Rose. Indeed, at one point, the beard is described as to make Simon look like the devil, as Cassandra writes. For an instant, the shadow of his head was thrown on the wall, and owing to the pointed beard, it was exactly like the devil. This phrasing certainly connects with what the beard represents. It is a visual marker of Simon's adult maleness, and also of the yet vague promise of sexuality that adult womanhood entails and marriage entails, certainly, which is a point of interest, of great interest and fear for both Cassandra and Rose. As Cassandra again states at one point, I know all about the facts of life, and I don't think much of them. And this is exactly the kind of understated language that makes for both the comic and the tragic, anxiety-filled ponderings for Cassandra. Definitely the bath sequence, as well as the beard itself, act as imagings of this new world that both Cassandra and her sister Rose are to be introduced to. And I believe that none serves this purpose as well as the bear episode, during which Rose is chased through the woods by Neil and Simon Cotton. Again, let me read out this longer quotation here. Rose, I said, you've been mistaken for a bear. I heard her gasp, the idiot, the idiot. Oh, Rose, don't be a fool, I cried. We'll have to explain. If you don't come with me, I never forgive you. I die rather than explain. She had vanished into the darkness at the back of the train. It suddenly came to me that if I could make Rose take her coat off, we could join in the pursuit, as if we had no connection with the bear. But before I had gone a couple of yards, I saw Rose clearly. She had got beyond the end of the platform and was scrambling up the little embankment. And as she was on all fours, she really did look exactly like a bear. There was a wild shout from the people on the platform. Rose topped the embankment and disappeared over into the fields. Now, in this vaudevillian sequence, during which Rose, wearing a fur coat, is mistaken for a bear and is chased by her love interest, Neil Cotton, one can already detect the obvious hunter-prey imagery between Rose and Neil. This is certainly a coquettish, flirtatious encounter between the two young people, which indeed culminates in the capturing of Rose, as she confesses to Cassandra. After he carried me across the railway line to the field behind the station, he set me down and said, "This is for slapping me," and then he kissed me. And yet, in Cassandra's eyes, the same scene consists of Rose metamorphosing into bear, and her capture is more a source of horror rather than clear romance, as Cassandra describes the same scene. And then high above everything, I heard the most piercing shriek. I lost my head completely. "It's my sister," I screamed. "He's killing her," of course, rather than kissing her. Now, as it could be seen from these episodes, hopefully, Dodie Smith's comic modes work both to relieve tension as well as to call attention to the plight of the girl. This, I believe, is especially significant in her work because in today's zeitgeist, the issues of teenage girls more and more come to be seen as the issues of humanity as well. Comedy functions effectively and traditionally in the novel in all these episodes, as there is every possibility that at any moment comedy may turn into tragedy. For a borderland, a threshold is walked by these girl characters, while phrased in delightfully understated and exaggerated language. The Beth episode thus consists of Cassandra's being walked in on by a strange adult man in the tub, and Rose herself is quite literally almost killed in the woods when her fur coat presents her as prey to the young man. Yet throughout all, Smith turns towards humor to make us hear what I think is an ever stronger voice, the voice of the girl, who is indeed very funny, but she's also quite frightened. And that has been it. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you ever so much, Anna. That was brilliant. Just start my video again. Thank you, thank you. Well done. Nori started off. We have to just, even if we virtually clap, we clap. That was great. I haven't read, again, that book I haven't read for years, and that was really insightful on the way comedy's operating in really interesting ways there. Thank you. So I'm sure there'll be some more questions. There'll be some questions at the end. So on to our final speaker of today. Once again, just bear with me. So our final speaker is Edith, and Edith's a senior lecturer at Karoli Gaspar University of the Reformed Church in Hungary. She wrote her PhD dissertation on Sylvia Plath's poetry and received her doctorate in Budapest in 2018. So welcome, Edith.
Thank you very much for your introduction. Can you see my first slide? Right, thank you. Well, the notion of comedy led me to investigate the theoretical background to what we consider humorous or what provokes laughter. And accordingly, I came up with a thesis that will simply check whether two of the maybe the most highly acclaimed theorists on humor were right in terms of a particular set of poems by Stevie Smith. So I'm going to investigate 4 different poems. If we look at Ari Bergson's theory of humor, this essay was published in 1900, so that the early 20th century was when thinkers began to consider what laughter comes from. And Bergson's insight was that laughter is basically a social phenomenon. And he went on to investigate what triggers laughter. He contends that the source of the comic is a certain mechanistic rigidity in a human being. And what is even more comic than a man who just can't arrest his momentum and stumbles on the pavement is a person who is inherently rigid in terms of his or her character. So absent-mindedness is basically the source of humor, as Bergson put it. And this absent-mindedness means that a person follows his or her own logic, which comes into collision with reality and actual circumstances, and this leads to laughter. Now, this absent-mindedness can also be seen as a kind of self-absorption, the lack of paying proper attention to society. And Bergson claims that all kinds of bad inclinations in people, such as miserliness or jealousy, may lead to such self-absorption. So on the other hand, we tend not to notice our own weaknesses, being self-absorbed. So it falls to the share of society, so it's society's task to correct these moral deficiencies. So basically, Bergson sees laughter as a moral corrective or educational tool. Society demands constant alertness and adjustment, flexibility from its members so that it can operate smoothly. So whenever an individual is self-absorbed or preoccupied with their own logic, then society must make this person alert. And they do this, or society does this by sort of inflicting a mild punishment on them in the form of laughter. So self-absorption is a threat to society. It is punished by laughter, and laughter serves as a moral corrective. Some 60 years later, Arthur Koestler took up the theme of the comic again in his work, The Act of Creation, in which he propounds the theory that there's a triptych that kind of visualizes all acts of creation. And we have the jester on the left, we have the sage in the middle, and the artist on the right. And he applied a cognitive approach to explaining the comic. And he said that the comic comes from a situation or idea that can be interpreted on two planes of reference that are both of them are self-consistent and logical in themselves, but this situation is at the intersection of these two planes and can be interpreted on several planes. For example, we can see this in jokes when we have an unexpected conclusion, and that triggers laughter. Now I'm going to apply these two theories to four poems. The first is Tenuous and Precarious. In this poem, the first person speaker lists male relatives. They are all dead, and we know this because she uses the past simple to refer to them, and there's a remark about the cat who is still alive, and also because she only counts the dead male relatives. So these relatives are called they have very telling names. For example, the guardians are called Tenuous and Precarious, meaning they are unreliable. And the bisociation is triggered by associating the role of the guardian with being trustworthy. Similarly, we associate a father with providing safety, but in this case, the father is called hazardous, dear old man. And the name also serves as a complete characterization of the person. For example, our son, Surreptitious, was surreptitious. So we sense a certain disappointment in all these relatives, in all the people closest to her. And in the final countdown, 6, 5, 4, 2, 1 Roman Finis. Finis is her own name, which is a kind of rebuff to all these disappointing relatives, and she's the one who survives them all, or in a way she eliminates these dead male relatives by this countdown. The source of humor in this poem is that the Latin proverb nomen est omen is taken quite literally, meaning that human complexity can be reduced to just one word, and also from the tension between the roles or functions of certain relatives, the ideal as opposed to the perceived reality of the actual family members. A similar sense of disappointment can be noticed in the next poem, but in this case, it is about the fabrication of a literary persona and contrasting it with the actual reality or the man himself. Now, the poem plays on the well-known literary incident when Coleridge explained the fragmentary status of his poem Kubla Khan by a story according to which during his inspired process of composition he was suddenly interrupted by a business visitor from a nearby village, and later on he was unable to resume the process of composition. And the speaker gives voice to this widely sort of held suspicion that this person from Porlock was actually just a fabrication of Coleridge to explain his own literary shortcomings. There is also a part in which the speaker playfully mocks Coleridge and comes up with several puns to highlight the absurdity of this explanation. In the next part, however, the poem assumes a prayer-like quality with insertion of a line such as forever and amen. And there is also an apostrophe and an invocation of this fictitious figure, "O person from Porlock, come quickly and bring my thoughts to an end." There are two implications. Some critics notice a death wish in this exclamation, but I would like to focus on another implication, which is simply a desire for mental inertia or inactivity. And we can see that in the next part, the speaker sort of gently, mockingly criticizes people who blame others for their own failures, thereby widening the implication of this very specific literary incident to a phenomenon that can be commonly observed. And the speaker also implies that this kind of sort of cowardice of blaming circumstances of other people for our own shortcomings is very common, yet it is socially accepted, whereas debunking such excuses is not accepted. And in the last part, we can also see how the poem was getting at this larger implication that that basically society encourages a certain mental inertia in its members, and the speaker contrasts the mental suffering caused by incessant thinking with the mental inertia required by society to keep busy, keep nice and busy, get some work to do, and that is applied as a kind of mental anodyne to depressing thoughts. So basically the last part becomes an apology for thinking as such, and the last implication is that the relatively low prestige of the speaker as artist is compared to the totemic mythical reputation of the romantic poet, even despite his cowardice to cover up his literary shortcomings. And the humor mostly comes from this figure of the hysterical Coleridge weeping and wailing, "I am finished, finished, I shall never write a word of it." Well, literature foregrounds language, and language is also foregrounded in the next poem, which has a ridiculously long title in contrast with the short poem itself. Now this lengthy title is a little poem in itself, and we can see that the common mother is nature, and dead brother, as we can see both from the illustration attached and from the poem, is a dead lamb. When the poem begins, we are presented with a very we could say primitive incantation: "Lamb, dead, dead lamb, he was, I am." Is this childish, repetitive and mindless pair of lines, however, again underlines that with this rhyme "lamb am," that the dead animal is indeed a sort of brotherly connection to the human speaker. However, as we go on, we can see that the next two lines present us with an absurdly convoluted syntax, and using an intransitive verb, transitive like books my eyes indifference, which is very unusual. And what is even more unusual is that the sympathy of the speaker is not generated by sensory perception, the sight of the dead animal, but by contemplating the linguistic phenomena that he was, I am, separation by a tense generates the compassion. And this begs the question whether this compassion is genuine. In the last four lines, we encounter parallel structures, can I see and not, which since they are the issue of the speaker's compassion are formulated in question forms. Can I see lamb dead as mutton and not a solitary button? In this case, the dead animal is seen as meat, as food, and obviously we don't react to food with compassion, but with very animalistic sort of physiological reaction of appetite that seriously sort of undermines our hope or expectation that the speaker is indeed mourning for this dead animal. And if we come back to the title and contrast it with the whole of the poem, we can see that the title never stated that the speaker is bereaved or the speaker grieves. It's nature who mourns for the dead animal. So the source of the humor is very complex in this case. It comes from the comparative length of the title and the text. It comes from the clear rhymes as opposed to the surprising connotations like tense, indifference, mutton, button. Also the stylistic shifts from the rudimentary incantation through the stilted syntax to this pathetic but at the same time absurd set of questions. And we can discover two types of association here. One is that the reaction to the death of a fellow creature, a fellow human, is sort of conflated with our reaction to meat, to food. And we can also see that or the rudimentary knowledge of Christian religion will make us associate the lamb with Christ. And indeed, in the communion, believers consume Christ's body. So it's mutton to lamb, to human brother, to Christ. And that's really surprising and in a way, food for thought. This sort of notion of feigned compassion is highlighted even more strongly in the last poem under discussion, which is probably the most well-known of Stevie Smith's poems. In Not Waving but Drowning, we immediately encounter an eerie atmosphere that sort of stops our initial reaction to this humorous counterposition of waving as opposed to floundering in the water, because we can see mentally a dead man and hear him speak. In this poem, two different perceptions are contrasted with regards to the circumstances of this man's death. The onlookers think that it was just a tragic sort of unfortunate accident due to circumstances, or the speaker's own, let's say, absent-mindedness, as opposed to the man's own perception. And we move from a very literal meaning or just a common sense explanation to a very tragic and even philosophical view of this this incident, in which the coldness and the distance, I was the person, the drowned man, says that I was much further out than you thought. First, we think it's just physical distance, but then it assumes metaphorical connotations, and the distance becomes the isolation from fellow humans. So basically, there's a serious process going on, and the other people interpret it as larking. So the serious mode clashes with the humorous mode. The structure also underlines this possibly allegorical connotation of the poem, because we have the first and the third stanza where the dead man speaks, and it's sort of these two stanzas embrace the middle stanza, but we can also see a progress as dead man sort of responds to what the onlookers say. So basically, we are presented with just a commonplace accident. Then the implication is widened to a personal tragedy. This is somebody who has been isolated all his life, and then it is again widened to an existential sort of anxiety when the speaker says, "Oh no, it was too cold always." And this triple structure, the three-part structure, the triple repetition of the no, the negation, highlights that maybe this is a view, this is an existentialist view of the human condition, that we are all isolated, we are all alone, and also that we all mutually misinterpret or misunderstand each other. And even though the novel is commonly interpreted as a comic poem, it operates on several levels. It has elements of horror, it has elements of comedy, as well as tragedy, and this convergence of the various tones gives its unique quality. And finally, I would like to just briefly sum up. So my thesis was that Koestler's and Bergson's theory can be aptly applied to these poems. Indeed, all of these poems operate on several planes of association, bisociation or multi-association, if we take it that way. So the ideal as opposed to reality, the outward sign becomes the essence, the persona is contrasted with the person, ideas that are acclaimed in a certain situation are sort of suspect in everyday life. Also, we can see how in this Death Berries poem, the human, the beast, and the divine is conflated. And finally, in terms of Bergson's mechanistic theory, I would like to highlight the moral corrective aspect of laughter. And it seems that the poet or the speakers in the poem single out two human weaknesses: the abdication of responsibility towards others and towards taking the blame for our own actions, as well as hypocrisy as in terms of showing and experiencing sympathy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Very much, Edith. That was brilliant. Thank you. Thank you once again. I mean, once again, I thought that was so informative, seeing the really complex ways that I've never thought about the humour's working there. So I think in all these papers, there's been some really interesting sort of digging, if that's the word, at humour and its implications and how it's working. So thank you very, very much, everyone. So as before, if you would like to virtually raise your hand if you have a question, you can obviously type it if you would prefer that. I have plenty of things written down here, but I'll save them up. Jane. Hi, Jane.
Hello. Thank you. Yes, I've got a question for Astyartha. I really enjoyed your paper. Thank you. It was fascinating and great to hear people talk about Richmal Crompton. As you say, the stories, the William stories, were originally written by Crompton for adults. And I wondered, you know, the extent to which that works, the dual audience aspect of her writing, her stories, and in Just William's luck, works for dual audiences, adults and children. How do you think that works, and does it work for you?
Basically, it was initially planned, it was Richmal Crompton's initial plan that the stories would appeal to an adult audience, but after it started being received by the younger audience, I personally don't think that she went too far into thinking about making the stories appeal to the adult audience, but she did keep the underlying themes of what I talked about in my paper, the political consciousness, the social consciousness. So I think that is a very important theme here. And about this mutual audience, something that you've pointed out, it is very important that children, I think this is something that children's authors, it's kind of a responsibility for them. I'm not saying that we have to impose that responsibility on them, but when books for children are being written, it is also our duty. It is also the duty of the writer to somehow remember that children do not live in an isolated world. Children do not live in a bubble. Children live in a society which comprises of adults, which comprises of adult complexity. So it is always good to prepare children step by step, maybe not by exposing them to the harsh truths first, but maybe maybe just getting them to get the feel of how the adult world looks like, how the adult world treats you like. So yeah, does that answer your question?
You're muted, Jane, but we saw you nodding. So yes. So we've got hands going up virtually and really. I think I saw Noreen first. So yeah, Noreen.
And this follows maybe a little bit from Jane, but I was thinking, well, all three of these papers spoke to each other so much. I just kept thinking, wow, what she said fits with what she said. Mm-hmm. So I have multiple questions. I don't know if I'll be able to get to all of them, but Astyartha, I was thinking, as Edith was writing, talking about Bergson's ideas of the moral corrective aspect of humor, that sort of gap that works between what people think they understand versus what's actually going on. It works for you quite a bit. That seems to be, especially in, say, that scene that you were showing us of William at dinner trying to explain to his parents that he needs to talk with his mouth open because they've given him, three different rules that don't fit with each other. But that sort of gap of understanding seems to be a space there of where the humor comes from. And I'm wondering if that fits well with what Jane is saying. Who finds that humor funny? I mean, maybe it's funny for the kids from one perspective, or just even getting that representation versus the adults in kind of thinking, how do we keep these kids under control, or how do we ever correct a child who seems uncorrectable? Anyway, I'm throwing more out an idea here, but it did seem that your paper and Edith's theories fit together so nicely.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with whatever you've said. And to me, to place it very simply, I think it is funny for audiences, for readers of all ages, for adult readers as well as young readers, only when it is read, only when they're reading it in the book, and when the adults don't have to face it in the dinner table, like William's dad and William's mom had to face it. So apart from that, I think that maybe these are questions that are quite subjective and quite circumstantial. Like, what are the questions, how much is the gap between this understanding of the situation from the adult perspective and from the child's perspective, and how grave is the situation? Like, if it gets dangerous, then maybe that is another different aspect. But something like William arguing with logic about why he should not be suppressed, why his voice should not be suppressed, that is perhaps interesting. That is perhaps something from which his parents also get to learn, because at the end, when William comes back home, then his parents are gather around him, and there's this very similar scene, like the scene in the dining table, where they are accusing him of what you do, why did you remove the shaving cream, why did you do this, why did you do that, and in the end they're like, tell us the story of your conquest. Tell us the story of all the adventure that you came home from. So, you know, I think there is also humor in the way Richmal Crompton ends the novel, with the adults being interested in William's world from being totally, dismissive of his world and his way of thoughts.
I don't know if
Thank
Edith
you.
would also like to add anything to that.
Yeah, well, it's wonderful that you mentioned this, Noreen, this sort of applicability of Bergson's theories to Astyartha's paper, because that's exactly what I was thinking. But she was saying, well, I had a suspicion that I've developed a monomania with Bergson, but it turns out that no, right? So this more a corrective aspect of what I was thinking is that these children's books could serve as kind of an educational sort of novels for the children, so as they read them, especially when I looked at these illustration. I don't mean the movie, but the cartoons or illustrations to the book, and you could see the consternation and maybe the anger or even rage on the face of the brother or this young lady who was so sort of unceremoniously attacked by this kind of aggressive sort of absent-mindedness of William, who just walks in his own world, and it's to make maybe these books could be used to show children how their supposedly quirky and original behavior might be experienced by adults, and to tell them or to warn them of the potential, let's say, negative social consequences of such behavior. So to maybe to raise a certain self-awareness in children. I don't know, what do you think about it? But I see these books as kind of okay, so it's kind of, as you said, that okay, children can finally see themselves represented. So there's a kind of a satisfaction of their narcissism or whatever we call it. But at the same time, it's also a curbing of their narcissism by showing the, well, not always general acclaim of their behavior.
Great answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Anne, good morning, Anne. I see your hand up there.
Yeah. Can you see my picture?
Yes.
Yeah. Funny.
Astyartha, were you trying to show us something?
Yes.
Here we are.
No, I see it again. I was going to say something very similar. I was really struck by the way in which each paper explored a darker mode of comedy. And Astyartha's paper reminded, or the discussion we've just had with Edith, reminded me of, I don't know whether people know it, an early 19th century German children's book called Struwwelpeter, which is quite, I don't know whether anybody knows it, but with poems, a little bit like, the one that Edith discussed of Stevie Smith's, of children, but all to do with children, didactic, to warn them. The girl that plays with fire and then burns the house and herself. The boy who won't eat his soup and then dies. Is very big, but then actually dies because he's not given anything else. And also with a sort of social critique, the boys who make fun of the little black boy, but then actually are carried away by the wind themselves. So there is that element, and Edith's paper made me think of that in relation to children's literature. But I wondered about Anna and Edith's papers, and would like to know what you think, because Anna seemed to the point of the whole thing seemed to be quite sinister, because it's a kind of socialization of girls into an acceptance of the violence of adult womanhood in heterosexual relationships. It's about being hunted, about being, being exposed to the gaze, the female body. They are both both girls are challenging that, but at the end, they accept it and they are socialized into accepting it in that romance narrative. So I wondered what Anna would want to say about that. And secondly, in Edith's paper about Stevie Smith, it's a very dark vision, I felt, because really it's about the comedy exposes the hypocrisy and the brutality of human life. So I wondered what you want to say about that.
So thank you so much for your comments. Let me just see if I understand your question correctly. So is it about how sinister the contents of the comedy is, or could you just rephrase a little bit?
Yeah, maybe I've got it wrong because I haven't read the novel. And I was going on what you were saying, and it seemed to me that there was a sort of concealed narrative behind the humor, which is really quite chilling. You know, girls have to get used to, in order to become women, they have to get used to being, to having their bodies, you know, exposed, because that's a kind of threshold to female adulthood, and they have to get used to being hunted down, and the hunting turns into a kiss. So the entire idea of the heterosexual relationship and romance is about violence. But I may have got this completely wrong, because I must actually, you know, humiliate myself here and confess that I started to read the novel because it was recommended to me by a PhD student, and I must be the only person in the world who didn't think it was funny, so I didn't persevere. So it may also be my comments may also be colored by my not really getting into it, and my not having a sense of humor, possibly.
Thank you. I'm sure that's not the case. Thank you again for your question. The thing about the novel is that it is deliberately written in very light-hearted manner. Again, I hope the quotes kind of show that off, even if people haven't read the book. And the entire atmosphere is, I suppose, could be characterized by a sense of quirkiness almost. A boho family, a bohemian family, rather, living their life. And yet, I think, I hope certainly that my point came across, and from your comments, they have. So I'm very happy about that. That there is certainly this layer of the sinister and of the dark, which makes the novel fit into these traditional ideas of what being introduced to adult womanhood, or rather an adult femininity, means. And yet what I enjoy most about this text is that this is not the only layer. Certainly, again, there's the lot more lighthearted coming of age layer above. There's even a very intriguing biblical structure as well when it comes to Cassandra's character, which again is another point of interest of mine, but it did not fit into this paper. So the darkness and the violence is always there, and yet because it goes hand in hand with, again, this magnified, heightened episodes, again, these almost early 20th century, late 19th century modes of comedy. You do have to dig for the violent parts when reading, and certainly the funniness for me is always there, but it is rather tiring at certain points. So I understand your reading experience. Thank you. I hope that that answered your question.
Absolutely, and I should really give it another go because, as I said, I felt, what's wrong with me when everybody regards this as funny. By maybe I was reading it in an atmosphere that was not suitable.
Thank you. Well, there's clearly lots and lots to say here. If you have a look in chat, there's actually a question for Anna. from Sophia. And obviously the chat box can stay open. So we are coming up to finishing time. So it's always kind of a shame to stop, but then I probably use this tired old metaphor before. I think it's best to leave a party still when there's lots going on. I won't say that anymore after now, but the conversation can keep on, going there. You can reply there. And obviously we can talk about these things more, really informally when we have the cocktails and comedy hour. So I think we'll finish the session now because we're going to be, the panelists will be meeting about 12:15, 12:20 for the 12:31. And so everyone else has a nice 30-minute break. So at this point, thank you very, very much to all our panelists for those really brilliant papers today. Thank you very much. It's been terrific. Thank you. And look forward to seeing everyone again in 30 minutes for the next panel. Thank you.